Chapter 9, Rival Syndicates. The neutral ground was supposed to be a gutted fish market in Navotas, stinking heavily of dried salt and rotting timber. General Alvez had called for a formal parley under the old underworld codes. A peace offering, his messengers had claimed, an attempt to apologize for the unauthorized actions of the rogue agent Bianca. Mateo Reyes didn't believe a single word of it. He sat at the center of a scarred wooden table in the dim expanse of the market. 4 of his armed Ascal enforcers stood quietly in the shadows behind him. Across the table sat General Alvez. The older man was built like a cinderblock, wearing a pressed military-style olive shirt that barely contained his thick shoulders. Behind him stood 6 elite mercenaries shipped up from the lawless southern provinces. "You handled the girl efficiently," Alvez said, his voice a gravelly rumble that echoed off the empty concrete walls. He casually lit a thick cigar. "She was an expensive contractor. I fully expected her to finish the job." "So this isn't an apology," Mateo replied, his face unreadable. Alvez laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He gestured to one of his mercenaries. The man stepped forward, dragging a bloodied, beaten figure by the collar of his shirt. It was one of Mateo's low-level port runners, a kid no older than 16, specifically chosen from the Tonda ranks. The boy's face was a swollen, unrecognizable mess. He sobbed quietly as the mercenary threw him violently onto the floor beside the table. "You're bleeding, Reyes," Alvez said, blowing a thick cloud of blue smoke across the table. "Don't pretend you aren't. 2 days ago, Agent Navarro's NBI task force seized one of your secondary warehouses in Quezon City. They didn't need a rat. They tracked a sloppy taillight on one of your delivery vans for 3 days, outsmarted your perimeter guards, and took 90 million pesos of your product. Just good, old-fashioned police work. You aren't a ghost anymore." Mateo kept his face perfectly still, but the sting of the Quezon City failure burned in his chest. Navarro had beaten him cleanly. It had violently shaken Mateo's belief in his own absolute control. "You have expanded too fast," Alvez continued. "You control the ports, but you're losing the streets. You are a boy wearing a suit you haven't grown into. Surrender the BGC distribution lines to the Devo Group, and I will let you keep your petty street corners in Tonda." Mateo looked down at the beaten runner. The anger inside him flared, hot and sharp, but he forced it down into a terrifying calm. "You came into my city, poisoned my drink, beat my men, and now you demand a tax on my product." "I demand compliance," Alvez growled, his hand resting heavily on his holster. "Or I will drown this entire city in blood." Mateo leaned forward. "You don't own the water here, General." Alvez sneered. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod to the mercenary standing nearest to him. The ambush was ruthlessly fast. The mercenary didn't reach for a gun. He drew a heavy, serrated combat knife from his chest rig and lunged directly across the width of the table, aiming straight for Mateo's throat. But Mateo had grown up anticipating violence in the slums. He kicked the heavy wooden table violently upward, catching the mercenary in the knees and throwing him off balance. The knife plunged deep into the wood inches from Mateo's hand. "Kill them!" Alvez roared, kicking his chair back and drawing his sidearm. The dark fish market instantly erupted into a deafening, chaotic crossfire. June, standing in the shadows, opened up with a suppressed submachine gun, chewing through the wooden pillars behind Alvez. The general's men returned fire with heavy assault rifles, the muzzle flashes strobing violently in the gloom. Mateo grabbed the collar of his beaten runner and dragged the boy backward behind a stack of rusted metal crates as concrete dust and splintered wood rained down on them. Bullets sparked violently off the floor, deafening in the enclosed space. "Fall back to the trucks." Mateo yelled over the horrific roar of the gunfire. It wasn't a panicked retreat, it was a tactical withdrawal. The Ascals systematically threw smoke grenades, blinding the mercenaries long enough for Mateo and his men to pile into their armored SUVs and crash through the chained gates of the market, speeding out into the torrential rain. Mateo sat in the passenger seat, breathing heavily, his suit covered in white concrete dust. He looked down at the unmarked black keycard resting securely in his palm, the one they had taken off Bianca an hour earlier. The master override for the Vanguard Hotel. The parley didn't go well. June asked grimly from the driver's seat, wiping a streak of blood from his cheek. Mateo reached into the back seat and grabbed a matte black shotgun, pumping a heavy shell into the chamber. Drive to Paranaque, Mateo instructed, his voice as cold as the rain sweeping across the windshield. It's time to hunt the general. The torrential rain hammering against the roof of the armored SUV sounded like loose gravel. It was 3 a.m. Mateo Reyes sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring up at the towering, brutalist architecture of the old Vanguard Hotel in Paranaque. To the average citizen, the concrete building looked like a decaying relic from the 1980s. But to the criminal underworld, it was known as the heavily fortified northern outpost of the Devo Group. And tonight, it was a tomb. 20 ex-military mercenaries inside, June said from the driver's seat. He racked the charging handle of a compact, suppressed submachine gun. The dull metallic clack was swallowed by the storm outside. Security rotation changes at 3:15 a.m. The lobby guards will be half asleep or staring at their phones. Mateo looked down at the unmarked black keycard resting in his palm. Bianca's keycard. The master override for the hotel's private penthouse elevator. We don't shoot unless we have to, until we hit the penthouse, Mateo instructed, his voice as cold as the rain sweeping across the windshield. He reached into the back seat and grabbed a matte black shotgun, sliding the heavy metal barrel under his tactical windbreaker. We move like ghosts. The goal is General Alvez. Everyone else is just an obstacle. In the back of the SUV, 4 of the most seasoned, battle-hardened ASCAL enforcers checked their weapons and nodded silently. Among them was Tomas, a fiercely loyal, brick-like enforcer who had fought beside Mateo since the Salazar days. Tomas checked his sidearm, whispering a prayer for his 16-year-old brother, Leo, to stay safe in the slums, a ritual he performed before every street war. These were young men who had grown up stabbing rivals over scraps of copper wire in Tonda. Now, they were geared up like a special operations hit squad. Let's hunt, Mateo whispered. They pushed out of the vehicle and moved swiftly through the torrential downpour, cutting through a dark service alley behind the hotel. June jimmied the lock on a rusted maintenance door, slipping inside with zero hesitation. The basement loading dock was dimly lit and smelled heavily of industrial bleach and wet cardboard. They moved with practiced silence. 2 armed Southern mercenaries were lounging by the freight elevator, smoking cigarettes and laughing over a joke. June closed the distance with terrifying speed. Before the smoking guards could react, June drove a combat blade up under the first man's jaw, severing the brain stem instantly. At the exact same moment, Mateo lunged like a shadow and crushed the second guard's windpipe with the steel barrel of his heavy shotgun. The guard collapsed instantly. They dragged the bodies behind the crates. No alarms. No noise. Mateo approached the private elevator and swiped the black keycard. The magnetic reader flashed a bright, validating green. The steel doors slid open. As the elevator began its long, silent ascent to the 30th floor, the tension inside the small metal box grew paralyzing. Mateo watched the digital floor counter rapidly climb. 20, 25. 28. Masks, Mateo ordered softly. The 5 ASCALs pulled heavy black balaclavas over their faces. Mateo didn't. He wanted General Alvez to look into the eyes of the boy from the slums before he died. Ding! The steel doors parted. The penthouse lobby was expansive, covered in thick red carpets and mirrored walls. 5 ex-military guards were stationed in the corridor holding assault rifles. They were highly trained, and they were awake. Before the doors had fully opened, a deafening burst of automatic fire chewed through the metallic elevator frame. An armed mercenary fired blindly down the corridor, the high-velocity rounds tearing toward Mateo's chest. Tomas lunged forward without hesitation, throwing his heavy shoulder into Mateo and physically shoving the gang leader out of the immediate line of fire. Two loud cracks echoed violently in the confined space as Tomas took twin bullets directly to his left shoulder. He grunted in extreme pain, slamming against the elevator wall, but miraculously kept his sidearm raised and firing. "I'm good, boss," Tomas gasped, his tactical shirt rapidly staining dark red. "Move! Contact!" June roared, returning fire blind around the edge of the elevator door. Mateo didn't hesitate. He dropped low, sliding out beneath the suppressive fire, his shotgun barking twice in rapid succession. The heavy buckshot tore through the soft body armor of two guards down the hall, throwing them backward into the mirrored walls in an explosion of glass and blood. The remaining Ascals flooded out, their disciplined silence replaced by the chaotic roar of a sustained firefight. It was ugly. Brutal. A third guard managed to drop another Ascal with a shot to the thigh before June stitched a line of holes across the man's chest. In less than 30 seconds, the corridor was choked with acrid gray smoke, the 5 guards dead or dying on the ruined carpet. Mateo stepped out from behind a marble pillar, breathing heavily, his ears ringing. He looked back at the elevator. Tomas was slouched against the steel wall, applying heavy pressure to his bleeding shoulder, offering a grim, pained nod to signify he would survive. Mateo barely looked at him, he just filed the act of extreme, selfless loyalty away as an asset in his ledger, already moving on to the next target. Tomas watched him wipe the blood from his tailored suit without a word of thanks, the cold realization from the warehouse creeping back into his mind. Mateo gritted his teeth, the reality of the war cementing in his chest. He turned to the double oak doors at the end of the hall. Before he could even raise his shotgun, a thunderous boom echoed from inside the suite. Crack! A high-caliber slug punched clean through the heavy oak door, missing Mateo's head by mere inches and obliterating a plaster bust behind him. General Alvez wasn't waiting to be breached. He was firing through the wood. "He's got a rifle down the hall," June yelled, pressing flush against the wall. Another splintering crack tore through the door, striking the marble floor near Mateo's boots. Mateo pumped a fresh shell into the chamber of the shotgun, his heart slamming against his ribs. The old warlord was dug in. Mateo signaled to June, pointing 2 fingers at the heavy iron locking mechanism. June nodded, pulling a flashbang from his tactical rig. He pulled the pin. Mateo swung around the corner, leveled his shotgun, and fired a deafening blast directly into the lock, blowing it out of the wood. The door swung inward. June instantly pitched the grenade into the luxurious suite and ducked back. Bang! The blinding flash and concussive shockwave rocked the hallway. Mateo immediately pushed inside. General Alvez was stumbling backward near his bed, temporarily deafened, a heavy, scoped hunting rifle slipping from his grasp. Even in his silk pajamas, the deeply scarred veteran looked like a cornered tiger. As his vision cleared, he lunged for a heavy revolver resting on his bedside table. Before Alvez could level the weapon, Mateo fired a second blast. The buckshot shredded Alvez's right arm, throwing the heavy revolver across the room. The general collapsed against the edge of his bed, gripping his bleeding shoulder, his face pale with agony and sudden shock. Mateo practically stalked into the room, pumping a fresh shell into the chamber of the shotgun. June and the Ascals fanned out, securing the perimeter, ensuring the suite was clear. Alvez looked up, his chest heaving. He stared at Mateo's young, hardened face. "You," the general spat, his voice thick with pain. "You're the rat from the slums." "Your honey trap failed, General," Mateo said, leveling the smoking barrel of the shotgun directly at the older man's face. "Bianca sends her regards." Alvez let out a wet, rattling laugh, blood staining his teeth. Even facing death, the old warlord refused to show fear. "You think you've won, boy? You think killing me secures your pathetic little empire? You're just a kid holding a king's ransom. The moment I die, the wolves will smell the blood in the water. The triads. The syndicates. They will tear you and your arrogant partner to screaming pieces. Mateo didn't flinch. He didn't monologue. He simply adjusted his aim. Let them try. Mateo pulled the trigger. The assassination of General Alvez sent a violent shockwave through the Philippine underworld. The Davao group, decapitated and terrified by the surgical precision of the strike, immediately retreated south to Mindanao to rebuild their fractured leadership. For a fleeting moment, Mateo and Marco stood alone at the peak of the mountain. With the southern cartel broken, their BGC nightclubs printed millions, their laundering fronts operated flawlessly, and their shipments through the Manila port ran on schedule. But General Alvez had been right. Nature despised a vacuum. And in the sprawling, chaotic ecosystem of Manila, extreme wealth attracted extreme predators. It started quietly, exactly 3 weeks after the hotel raid. A heavy, torrential rain beat mercilessly against Mateo's dark raincoat as he stood in a narrow, trash-filled alleyway in Binondo. The air smelled thick with stagnant water and rotting cabbage from the nearby vegetable markets. At his boots lay the ruined body of an 18-year-old ASCO runner named Jojo. The kid's throat had been brutally and surgically slit from ear to ear. The crimson pool beneath him was already being washed away by the storm. Mateo knelt, his jaw tight, his hands devoid of warmth. His customized black duffel bag, typically containing 2 million pesos of Marco's collected extortion money, was gone. They waited for him in the shadows, June said quietly, standing behind Mateo with a heavy flashlight illuminating the horrific scene. The cold rain bounced off June's shoulders as his eyes scanned the dark fire escapes above. No struggle. One slice. Like a butcher. Mateo slowly stood up, looking at the hollow, lifeless eyes of a kid who had grown up kicking empty cans down the streets of Tonda. This wasn't cartel retaliation. This was a professional message. 2 days later, the violence escalated. A commercial laundry truck owned by Victor Tan was forcefully hijacked on EDSA by armed men. The truck was later found burned out in a junkyard in Navotas, its cargo of laundered cash missing. Mateo and Marco stood inside the dimly lit basement counting room of the Novice Club, staring at a map of Metro Manila spread across a steel table. Mateo was sliding crimson thumbtacks across the map, marking the exact locations of the recent attacks. "It's not the Davao group," Marco said, his face a mask of furious concentration. He was wearing his usual tailored suit, but the relaxed, arrogant posture of a victorious king was gone. They don't operate this far north, and their style is heavy, loud, and disorganized. This is painfully precise. This is local. June walked into the counting room, tossing a heavy, blood-stained gold ring onto the table. It clattered loudly against the metal. "The boys caught one of the hijackers trying to spend our missing cash at a cockfight in Caloocan," June reported grimly. "We broke his jaw. He finally gave us a name before he passed out." Mateo stared at the gold ring. It was heavily engraved with the image of a coiled dragon. "Lao Shen," June said. "He runs the regional operations for the Red Dragon Syndicate out of Hong Kong. They've been using Binondo as a smuggling hub for counterfeit electronics for a decade. But apparently, they want to upgrade." Marco's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "They want the port." "They don't just want the port," Mateo corrected, studying the heavy clusters of red pins on the map. "They want the clubs. They want the entire distribution network. Lao Shen knows we just finished a war with the South. He thinks we're exhausted. He thinks we don't have the manpower to fight a two-front war." Marco picked up the bloody gold ring, examining it under the harsh fluorescent lights of the basement. The cautious, calculating businessman who had recruited Mateo from the slums was gone. In his place stood a man addicted to his own power, unwilling to lose a single fraction of an inch of his territory. "Lao Shen fundamentally misunderstands exactly what kind of men we are," Marco whispered, dropping the ring onto the map. Marco looked at June. "Bring me Victor Tan. Tell him to liquidate 5 million pesos from the reserve accounts immediately." "What are we buying?" Mateo asked, raising an eyebrow. Marco offered a horrific, calm smile. We aren't buying anything, Teo. We are going to burn Chinatown to the ground. Over the next 48 hours, the capital city descended into an invisible, hyperviolent war. Marco didn't just fight back, he proved overwhelmingly ruthless in defending his territory. He weaponized every single corrupted asset he had purchased over the last year. He didn't try to negotiate with Lao Shen. He didn't sit down for a civilized tea summit. He unleashed the hounds of hell. On Wednesday night, 3 underground casinos secretly operated by the Red Dragon Syndicate in Binondo were simultaneously raided by a armed, highly militarized police task force. Senator Velasco had made a single phone call, framing the triad fronts for terrorism financing. The police smashed the gambling tables, seized tens of millions of pesos in illegal chips, and dragged dozens of Lao Shen's men into the backs of armored paddy wagons. On Thursday afternoon, a shipment of counterfeit luxury goods belonging to the triad arrived at the Manila port. Within 10 minutes, Marco's corrupt customs officer, Santos, flagged the container for emergency hazardous materials inspection. The container was seized by the government and promptly incinerated, costing Lao Shen an estimated 20 million pesos in pure overhead. But political maneuvering wasn't enough. Marco wanted blood. On Friday night, the war spilled into the streets. Mateo led the physical retaliation. He and June loaded 3 unmarked vans with 24 armed ASCAL enforcers, kids who had cut their teeth dodging bullets in Tonda, now armed with automatic weapons funded by Marco's endless bank accounts. They targeted a neon-lit karaoke complex in the heart of the tourist district, known to be Lao Shen's primary regional headquarters. Mateo didn't even bother to hide his face. He walked straight through the front doors of the guarded complex, holding a suppressed assault rifle. When the triad guards stationed in the lobby reached for their weapons, the ASCALs opened fire, shattering the glass doors and tearing the lobby apart in a storm of lead. Mateo moved through the karaoke halls like a machine. The pounding, upbeat pop music echoing from the private singing rooms formed a surreal, terrifying soundtrack to the violence. They kicked open doors, executing any triad enforcers they found. Patrons screamed, fleeing into the chaotic streets as the nightclub was purged. In a private VIP room at the back of the complex, Mateo found Lao Shen's top lieutenant, a heavily tattooed man clutching a submachine gun. Before the lieutenant could raise the weapon, Mateo shot him twice in the knees. The man screamed, collapsing onto the glass coffee table, shattering it instantly. Mateo walked up to the screaming lieutenant, casually kicking the dropped weapon away. The room was illuminated by a flashing, multicolored disco ball, casting shifting colors across the blood-stained carpet. June stepped into the room, holding a heavy red plastic jerrycan. The overwhelming smell of cheap gasoline instantly flooded the enclosed space. "Tell Lao Shen," Mateo said, leaning down so the terrified lieutenant could hear him over the blaring karaoke track, that Manila does not belong to the Red Dragon. It belongs to Marco Dizon. And if I see another one of your men stepping into my territory, I won't just hit your businesses. I will come to Hong Kong and kill him myself. Mateo stood up and nodded to June. June began dumping the heavy gasoline all over the expensive leather couches, the broken tables, and the expensive electronics. The triad lieutenant dragged his shattered legs backward across the carpet, begging for mercy in broken English. Mateo didn't listen. He struck a match. The small, orange flame illuminated his emotionless eyes. He dropped the match onto the soaked carpet. The entire room instantly erupted into a deafening roar of orange heat. Mateo and June turned their backs on the screaming man and walked calmly out of the burning complex. By the time the wailing sirens of the city fire trucks could be heard in the distance, the unmarked vans had already vanished into the sprawling, chaotic traffic of the metropolis. Lao Shen eventually sent an encrypted message to Marco's secure servers 3 days later. It wasn't a threat. It was a complete surrender. Decapitated by Mateo's targeted assassinations, crippled financially by the customs seizures, and terrified by the sudden immense pressure from bought politicians, the Red Dragon Syndicate officially conceded the territory, pulling their remaining operations out of Metro Manila. The immediate threat was eliminated. The city was finally theirs. But as the war ended, Mateo realized something truly terrifying. The extreme violence hadn't exhausted Marco. It had energized him. When Mateo returned to the novice penthouse that night, he didn't find the meticulous accountant he had partnered with. Marco was sprawled across the velvet sofa, his expensive silk shirt completely unbuttoned, laughing maniacally at a muted television screen. A massive pile of uncut cocaine covered the glass coffee table, alongside 3 empty bottles of vintage champagne. "We are untouchable, Teo," Marco shouted, his eyes wide, dilated, and terrifyingly manic. He didn't even ask about the casualties or the police response. He just forcefully wiped his nose, smearing white powder across his cheek. "We didn't just beat them. We broke their spirits. They are insects." Mateo stared at the man who had once lectured him on the importance of camouflage and quiet shell companies. The careful, disciplined money launderer was officially dead, replaced by a dangerously intoxicated tyrant who genuinely believed he was an invincible god. And gods, Marco declared, staggering to his feet to look out over the glittering skyline, required temples.